Dominic Hayes stood in his marble-floored penthouse office, staring at the demolition plans spread across his mahogany desk. The boy with torn sneakers and empty pockets was nowhere to be found in this man worth $200 million. Yet something about the address on those blueprints made his chest tighten. He didn't know that in just 48 hours, he'd be face to face with his own past, staring into the eyes of a child who lived in the exact same broken-down house where his dreams had once seemed impossible. He didn't know that one small boy would make him question everything he'd built, everything he'd become, and everything he thought he'd left behind. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gleaming towers of downtown Chicago as Dominic Hayes adjusted his Italian silk tie and stepped into his private elevator. At 38, he commanded respect in every boardroom he entered, his presence filling spaces with an authority that had been earned through years of calculated risks and relentless ambition. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man who had transformed himself completely, someone who bore little resemblance to the scrawny kid who once scrounged for quarters in couch cushions just to buy lunch. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Dominic could still remember the exact moment he'd decided to reinvent himself, standing in the guidance counselor's office at Jefferson High School, wearing his only good shirt that his mother had ironed 3 times to get the wrinkles out. Mrs. Rodriguez had looked at his grades, his test scores, his application for a partial scholarship to Northwestern, and said with genuine surprise, "You know, Dominic, you might actually make something of yourself." The words had been meant as encouragement, but they'd cut him deep. The implication that his success would be unexpected, that someone from his neighborhood achieving anything worthwhile was noteworthy, had lit a fire in him that burned for 2 decades. The elevator descended 50 floors in silence, delivering him to the underground garage where his black Bentley waited. As he settled into the leather seats, his phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, Miranda. The Riverside Development Project was ready for his final approval. All that remained was a personal visit to the site, a formality he rarely bothered with, but something about this particular deal nagged at him. Perhaps it was the address, Maple Street in the old Riverside neighborhood, a place that felt familiar in a way that made his stomach clench. His driver, Carlos, had been with him for 5 years, long enough to know when his boss preferred silence. They pulled out of the garage and into the Chicago morning traffic, past the familiar landmarks of Dominic's adult life. The Chicago Board of Trade, where he'd made his first major deal at 25. The Ritz-Carlton, where he kept a penthouse apartment he rarely used, but maintained as a symbol of how far he'd climbed. The exclusive men's club where he networked with other titans of industry, men who spoke casually of millions and accepted him as one of their own, never suspecting that he'd once eaten government cheese and worn shoes held together with electrical tape. The drive across the city was a journey through time as much as geography. The pristine glass towers of the financial district gave way to modest brick buildings, then to neighborhoods where paint peeled from window frames and weeds pushed through cracked sidewalks. Dominic's jaw tightened as he recognized the landscape of his childhood, the same broken streetlights and potholed roads that had once seemed like prison bars keeping him trapped in a world of want and limitation. He remembered walking these streets as a teenager, his backpack heavy with library books and dreams that felt impossibly large for someone from his zip code. He'd mapped out every scholarship opportunity, every academic program, every possible pathway out of the poverty that had defined his family for generations. His mother, Sarah Hayes, had been both his biggest supporter and his greatest source of guilt. She'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, cleaning offices before dawn, stocking shelves at the grocery store during the day, and serving drinks at a dive bar until midnight. She never complained, never made him feel responsible for their struggles, but he'd seen the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. His phone rang, pulling him from his reverie. "Hayes," he answered curtly. "Dominic, It's Marcus from the development team. We're all set for tomorrow's demolition. The families have been relocated, and the crew is ready to begin at dawn. Marcus Williams was a competent project manager, efficient and thorough, but he lacked the vision that had made Dominic successful. He saw buildings as structures to be torn down and replaced, not as repositories of human experience and memory. The Riverside project was typical of their collaborations, a profitable venture that would transform a struggling neighborhood into something more economically viable. "Good," Dominic replied, though the word felt strange in his mouth. "I'm heading to the site now for a final walkthrough." "Is that really necessary? We've got everything under control. The permits are in order, the environmental assessments are complete, and the demolition company has excellent safety record." Dominic's fingers drummed against the leather armrest, a nervous habit he'd developed during his early days in business, when every deal felt like a make-or-break moment. "I like to see what I'm building on." "Of course, sir. Just remember that we're on a tight timeline. The investors are expecting to see progress, and any delays could impact our other projects." As he ended the call, the Bentley turned onto Maple Street, and Dominic's breath caught in his throat. There it was, third house from the corner, the same peeling yellow paint and sagging front porch that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. Number 47 Maple Street, the house where he'd spent the most formative and painful years of his life. The house he'd sworn never to see again. The neighborhood looked smaller than he remembered, shrunken by time and perspective. The houses that had once seemed substantial now appeared fragile, their modest dimensions exposed by his adult understanding of real estate and construction. But the essential character remained unchanged, the working-class dignity of families making do with less, the small acts of care that transformed humble dwellings into homes. He parked across the street and sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The memories flooded back with startling clarity. His mother, Sarah, working 3 jobs just to keep them fed, her exhausted face illuminated by the flickering light of their old television. The sound of his father's footsteps on the front porch, heavy with disappointment, and the smell of whiskey, before he disappeared entirely when Dominic was 12. The nights he'd lain awake listening to his mother cry, promising himself that someday he'd have enough money to fix everything, to make it all better. Robert Hayes had been a dreamer whose dreams had curdled into bitterness. He'd talked constantly about the business he was going to start, the invention he was going to patent, the big break that was always just around the corner. But his schemes never materialized, and his frustration had manifested in increasingly frequent trips to Murphy's Tavern down the street. The night he'd left for good, Dominic had heard the argument through the thin walls, his mother's voice pleading for Robert to think about his son, his father's voice slurred and angry, insisting that he was better off without them. Both. A movement in the front yard caught his attention. A small boy, maybe 10 years old, was kneeling in the dirt beside the porch, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he carefully planted something in the hard-packed earth. The child wore a faded red t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees, his shoes held together with duct tape. Dominic's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the boy work with the same concentrated determination he remembered from his own childhood, when he'd tended a small garden in that exact spot, dreaming of vegetables that might stretch their meager grocery budget. The garden had been his mother's idea, born from desperation as much as hope. She'd read somewhere that growing your own food could save money, and even $20 a month in grocery savings would make a difference in their budget. Dominic had embraced the project with the intensity he brought to everything, reading library books about soil composition and plant spacing, carefully tending each seedling as if their survival depended on it. In many ways, it had. The garden had given him a sense of purpose, a belief that with enough effort and care, he could make something beautiful grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Dominic stepped out of the Bentley and crossed the street. The boy looked up at his approach, And Dominic found himself staring into eyes that were startlingly familiar, not in their color or shape, but in their expression of guarded hope mixed with premature wisdom. This child had seen too much, understood too early that the world was not a place of guaranteed kindness or security. The boy's face showed the quiet wariness that children develop when they've learned that adults aren't always reliable, that promises can be broken and dreams can disappoint. But there was something else there too, a stubborn optimism that reminded Dominic so powerfully of his younger self that he felt momentarily dizzy. "Hi there," Dominic said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "What are you planting?" The boy sat back on his heels, wiping his dirty hands on his jeans. His palms were stained with soil, and there was a streak of mud across his cheek that he'd apparently acquired while concentrating on his work. "Tomatoes," he replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp that comes from too many nights of worry. "My mom says they won't grow in this soil, but I figured it was worth trying." Dominic knelt beside the boy, his expensive suit jacket touching the same earth where he'd once knelt with the same desperate optimism. The soil was indeed poor, hard-packed clay mixed with debris, but he could see that the child had done his best to prepare it, mixing in what looked like compost and carefully removing rocks and bits of trash. "I used to have a garden here," he said quietly. "Right in this spot." The boy's eyes widened with genuine interest. "You lived here?" "A long time ago." Dominic picked up a handful of soil, feeling its familiar texture between his fingers. The smell of earth and growing things transported him instantly back to childhood, to summer mornings when he'd checked on his plants before the neighborhood woke up, to the thrill of discovering the first green shoots breaking through the chawl. Ground. "I planted tomatoes too, and green beans, even tried corn one year, though it never got taller than my knee." The boy leaned forward eagerly, hungry for details from someone who understood his project. "Did they grow? The tomatoes?" Dominic smiled, remembering his mother's surprised delight when they'd harvested their first red tomato, small and imperfect, but sweeter than anything they'd ever tasted. She'd sliced it carefully, savoring each piece, and declared it the best tomato she'd ever eaten. It had been a moment of pure joy in a life that had contained too few of them. Some did. The best ones always seemed to be the ones that struggled the most. The boy nodded seriously, as if this wisdom made perfect sense to him. Children from neighborhoods like this learned early that struggle and strength often went hand in hand, that the things you worked hardest for were the ones you valued most. "I'm Jayden," he said, extending a dirt-stained hand with the formal politeness that some children develop when they spend a lot of time around adults. "Dominic." They shook hands with the gravity of a business deal, though Dominic felt something shift inside him at the contact, a recognition that went deeper than names or appearances. This child's calloused palm, the careful way he spoke, the old soul look in his young eyes. It was like looking at a photograph of himself from 30 years ago. "Are you here about the demolition?" Jayden asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way children learn to be when they're used to disappointment. The question carried no accusation, just weary acceptance of another adult who might represent change he couldn't control. The question hit Dominic like a physical blow. The casual way the boy mentioned it, as if demolition and displacement were just facts of life, spoke to a childhood shaped by instability and forces beyond his understanding. "How do you know about that?" Jayden shrugged, turning back to his planting with the practiced nonchalance of a child who'd learned not to show too much emotion about things that might hurt. "The man in the suit came by last week, said we had to move by tomorrow. Mom's been packing, but she cries when she thinks I'm not looking." He pressed the soil carefully around a small seedling, his movements gentle and precise. "I know we won't be here to see if these grow, but I wanted to plant them anyway. For whoever comes next, I guess." The simple statement contained a generosity of spirit that left Dominic speechless. Here was a child facing displacement, loss of the only home he'd known, and his response was to plant something beautiful for strangers. It was an act of faith so pure and selfless that it made Dominic's throat tight with emotion. "Where will you go?" Dominic managed to ask. "Mom found a place across town. It's smaller, and the rent's higher, but it's all we can afford." Jayden's voice carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd learned early that life was a series of adaptations and compromises. "She says we'll be fine, but I know she's scared. She works 2 jobs already, and with the longer commute, she'll have to quit the one at the diner." The practical implications of displacement hit Dominic with unexpected force. This wasn't just about buildings and development. It was about a mother who would lose income, a child who would lose stability, a family whose careful balance would be thrown into chaos. He thought about his own mother, how she juggled multiple jobs and still barely made ends meet, how every change in their circumstances had sent ripples of stress through their small household. "What jobs does your mom have?" Dominic found himself asking. Jayden looked up from his planting, apparently seeing nothing odd about discussing family finances with a stranger. In neighborhoods like this, economic struggles weren't secrets to be hidden, they were simply facts of life. "She's a nurse's aide at the hospital, and she works weekends at Tony's Diner on Elm Street. She wanted to be a real nurse, but she couldn't afford the school for long enough." The matter-of-fact way Jayden described his mother's deferred dreams hit Dominic hard. How many people in this neighborhood had bigger aspirations that had been ground down by economic necessity? How many potential doctors, teachers, engineers, artists were working multiple jobs just to survive? Their talents never fully realized because they couldn't afford the luxury of following their dreams. The front door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch. She was probably in her early 30s, but life had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that identified her as a healthcare worker. When she saw Dominic, her expression grew wary, the automatic caution of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors often brought unwelcome news. "Jayden, honey, come inside," she called, her voice carrying the protective edge that mothers develop when they sense potential threat. "It's okay, Mom," Jayden replied, but he stood and brushed the dirt from his knees with obvious reluctance. "This is Dominic. He used to live here." The woman, whom Dominic assumed was Lisa Bell based on the paperwork he'd reviewed, walked down the porch steps with careful, measured steps. She moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to being on her feet for long hours, but there was tension in her shoulders that spoke of chronic stress. "Are you from the development company?" she asked, her chin raised in defiance despite the tremor in her voice. "I am," Dominic replied, then found himself adding, "but I'm not here in an official capacity. I was just driving by and saw Jayden planting." Lisa's expression softened slightly, though she remained alert. Her eyes flicked between Dominic and her son, clearly trying to assess the situation and any potential threat it might represent. "He's been working on that garden for weeks. I keep telling him we won't be here to see it grow, but he says it doesn't matter." "It matters," Dominic said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "It always matters." Something in his tone made Lisa study his face more carefully. She had the sharp intelligence of someone who'd learned to read people quickly, to identify those who might help and those who might harm. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to reassure her slightly. "You really did live here, didn't you?" "From the time I was 8 until I was 18. Dominic looked up at the house, noting the same loose shutter he'd always meant to fix, the same crack in the concrete steps that had tripped him countless times. The yellow paint was more faded now, and the porch sagged more noticeably, but the bones of the place were unchanged. "My mother and I lived in the front bedroom. She worked 3 jobs to keep us here." "What happened to her?" Lisa asked gently, her voice softening with instinctive compassion. Dominic's jaw tightened as it always did when he thought about his mother's final years. "Cancer. She died 2 years after I graduated high school. By then, I was already working, trying to save enough to get us out of here, but it was too late." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, but they carried the weight of 20 years of regret. Sarah Hayes had been diagnosed with breast cancer when Dominic was a junior in college, working his way through school with a combination of scholarships, loans, and part-time jobs. She'd hidden the symptoms for months, unable to afford regular medical care and unwilling to burden her son with worry about something she couldn't control. By the time the pain became unbearable and she finally saw a doctor, the cancer had spread. The treatments were expensive and brutal, eating up what little savings they had and forcing her to quit 2 of her 3 jobs. Dominic had wanted to drop out of school to care for her, but Sarah had refused to let him sacrifice his future for her illness. Their final fight had been about his college education, with her insisting he stay in school and him arguing that family was more important than degrees. She'd won, as she usually did, but the victory had cost her everything. She died in a charity ward at Cook County Hospital, alone because Dominic was taking his final exams, having been assured by the doctors that she had weeks left when she actually had hours. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared understanding. Lisa had walked the same tightrope of barely making ends meet, had felt the same crushing responsibility to provide for a child while the world seemed determined to make that impossible. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Dominic nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd spent 20 years building walls around those memories, convincing himself that the pain had made him stronger, that the struggle had been worth it because it had driven him to succeed. But standing here, watching Jayden carefully water his fragile seedlings, he felt those walls crumbling. "Mr. Dominic," Jayden said, looking up from his garden with the earnest intensity that seemed to characterize everything he did. "If you lived here, you must understand why Mom doesn't want to leave. This place isn't much, but it's ours. We've made it home." The simple words cut through Dominic's carefully constructed defenses like a blade. He remembered his own desperate love for this broken-down house, how he'd spent hours imagining the improvements he'd make someday, the fresh paint and new windows that would transform it into something beautiful. He dreamed of success not as an escape from this place, but as a way to make it better. But somewhere along the way, that dream had changed. Success had become about distance, about putting as much space as possible between himself and the poverty that had shaped his childhood. He'd convinced himself that leaving was victory, that forgetting was healing, that the measure of his achievement was how thoroughly he could erase the boy who'd once knelt in this same dirt. "I understand," he said quietly, "but sometimes we have to leave the places we love. Did you ever come back?" Jayden asked with the simple logic of childhood. "After you left, I mean." Dominic shook his head, feeling the weight of that absence like a physical pain. "I told myself I'd moved on to better things." "But you're here now," Jayden pointed out, his young voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "Yes," Dominic acknowledged, the word heavy with implication. "I'm here now." Lisa glanced at her watch and sighed, the sound carrying the exhaustion of someone juggling too many responsibilities. "Jayden, we need to get back to packing, and I have to get ready for my shift at the hospital." "You work at the hospital?" Dominic asked, though he already knew from Jayden's earlier explanation. "I'm a nurse's aide," Lisa replied, a note of pride in her voice despite her exhaustion. "It doesn't pay much, but I like helping people, and the evening shift means I can be here when Jayden gets home from school." The logistics of her life painted a picture of careful calculation and constant sacrifice. Evening shifts at the hospital probably paid slightly better than days, but they also meant leaving Jayden alone in the evenings, trusting that a 10-year-old could handle homework and dinner and bedtime routines without supervision. It was the kind of impossible choice that single parents in her situation faced daily, balancing economic necessity against parental responsibility. What about your other job? Lisa's smile was tired, but genuine. I clean offices downtown 3 mornings a week. It's not glamorous, but every dollar counts. She paused, then added with a self-deprecating laugh, I've become an expert at fitting sleep around work schedules. Dominic felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same feeling he'd had watching his mother work herself to exhaustion. The casual way Lisa mentioned her sacrifices, as if working 2 jobs and functioning on minimal sleep was just a normal part of life, reminded him of his mother's quiet heroism. How long have you been living here? 4 years, Lisa replied, her voice growing softer as she looked at the house with obvious affection. We moved in after Jayden's father left. The rent was cheap, and Mrs. Patterson next door looks out for Jayden when I'm working. The mention of Jayden's father was casual, without bitterness, but Dominic caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the departure hadn't been amicable. Another single mother abandoned by a man who couldn't handle the responsibility. Another child growing up without a father's presence. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Where's Mrs. Patterson now? She moved to live with her daughter in Florida last month. That's when we got the notice about the demolition. Lisa's voice caught slightly, and Dominic realized that the elderly neighbor had probably been more than just a babysitter. She'd been family, the kind of chosen grandmother that helped hold communities together. The timing couldn't have been worse. The loss of Mrs. Patterson represented more than just the departure of a helpful neighbor. It was the erosion of the informal support networks that made survival possible for families like Lisa's. Without that safety net, her careful balance of work and childcare became even more precarious. The demolition notice hadn't just threatened their housing, it had accelerated the breakdown of everything that made their life manageable. Dominic looked around the neighborhood, really seeing it for the first time in decades. The houses were small and shabby, but most showed signs of care. Small gardens and fresh paint on front doors. Children's toys scattered in yards that spoke of families making the best of their circumstances. This wasn't just a collection of buildings to be demolished. It was a community, a place where people had built lives and relationships and dreams. An elderly man was watering his flowers in the yard next door, moving slowly but purposefully among the marigolds and petunias that brightened his small plot. Across the street, a woman in a food service uniform was getting into an old Honda, probably heading to work at one of the restaurants downtown. Children's bicycles leaned against porch railings, and window boxes full of herbs suggested families stretching grocery budgets with homegrown seasonings. I should let you get back to your packing, he said, though every instinct screamed at him to stay, to find some way to fix this. Thank you for talking to Jayden about the garden, Lisa said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude. It means a lot to him to know that someone else cared about this place the way he does. As Dominic walked back to his car, he heard Jayden call out behind him. Mr. Dominic, if you see the tomatoes growing, will you tell me, even if we're not here? Dominic turned back, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. The boy stood beside his carefully tended seedlings, hope and resignation warring in his young face. I will, he promised, though he knew that by tomorrow there would be nothing left but rubble and empty lots. The drive back to his office passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Dominic tried to focus on the practical aspects of the development project, the jobs it would create, the modern housing that would replace the deteriorating neighborhood. The Riverside development would house 3 times as many families as currently live there, with modern amenities and energy-efficient construction. It was progress, urban renewal, exactly the kind of project that won awards and attracted positive media attention. But Jayden's face kept intruding on his thoughts, the way the boy had carefully tended those seedlings with the same hope Dominic had once felt. The child's simple generosity, planting something beautiful for strangers he'd never meet, had exposed something in Dominic that he'd thought he'd successfully buried. The successful businessman, the self-made millionaire, the man who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms, all of that felt suddenly fragile in the face of a 10-year-old's faith in the possibility of growth. Back in his penthouse office, Dominic spread the demolition plans across his desk once more. The Riverside development would be a masterpiece of modern urban planning. 300 units of luxury condominiums, with all the amenities his target demographic desired. Underground parking, fitness centers, rooftop gardens for residents who wanted the aesthetics of growing things without the effort of actually tending them. The profit margins were substantial, and the project would cement his reputation as a developer who could transform blighted neighborhoods into desirable addresses. His business partner, Richard Calloway, had identified the Riverside area as ripe for development 2 years earlier. Property values were depressed, the existing housing stock was deteriorating, and the demographics suggested that most current residents could be relocated without significant political resistance. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood that urban planners described as underutilized, a euphemism that made displacement sound like optimization. Dominic pulled up the financial projections on his computer, reviewing the numbers that had made this project so attractive. The land acquisition costs were minimal. Most of the existing structures could be demolished rather than renovated, and the market research indicated strong demand for the type of housing they planned to build. Young professionals who worked downtown but wanted more space than high-rise apartments could provide, couples starting families who valued modern amenities over historic character, investors looking for rental bana. Properties in an appreciating market. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Demolition crew confirms 6 a.m. start time. Congratulations on another successful project. Dominic stared at the message for a long moment, then set his phone aside without responding. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, his reflection ghost-like against the evening sky. Somewhere out there, Lisa Bell was working her shift at the hospital, while Jayden did homework at a kitchen table in the house Dominic had once called home. Tomorrow, that table would be gone, along with the garden and the memories and the dreams of a little boy who believed tomatoes could grow in impossible soil. The city spread out before him, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one a story of struggle and hope and compromise. From this height, the individual tragedies and triumphs were invisible, reduced to abstract patterns of urban development and economic growth. It was easier to make decisions about neighborhoods when you thought of them as statistics rather than communities, when families became demographic data points rather than people with names and dreams and carefully tended gardens. He thought about his mother, about the dreams she'd sacrificed to keep him fed and housed and safe. She'd died before she could see him succeed, before he could buy her the house with the garden she'd always wanted. All her sacrifices had been for his future. But what kind of future was he building if it required destroying the homes of families like theirs? Sarah Hayes had talked constantly about someday having a real garden, not just the small plot beside their rental house, but acres of vegetables and flowers where she could spend her retirement. She'd collect seed catalogs and plan elaborate layouts during her few free moments, sketching garden designs on the backs of envelopes, and dreaming of the day when she wouldn't have to choose between buying groceries and buying seeds. The irony wasn't lost on Dominic that he now had the resources to create the garden his mother had dreamed of, but she wasn't alive to see it. The money he'd accumulated, the success he'd achieved, all of it felt hollow when measured against the one person who'd believed in him from the beginning. He'd built an empire, but he'd lost the woman who'd taught him that the most important things in life couldn't be bought. The next morning, Dominic arrived at the Riverside site before dawn. The demolition crew was already there, massive machines that looked like mechanical monsters in the dim light. Workers in hard hats and safety vests moved with practiced efficiency, setting up equipment and establishing safety perimeters. The foreman, a burly man named Tony, approached with a clipboard and a grin that suggested he enjoyed his work a little too much. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. We're all set to begin. Should have the whole block cleared by the end of the week." Tony Ricci had been doing demolition work for 15 years, and he took professional pride in his ability to bring down buildings safely and efficiently. He'd worked on some of Chicago's most high-profile demolition projects, including the implosion of several outdated public housing complexes that had made the evening news. To him, the Riverside Project was just another job, another collection of structures that had outlived their usefulness. Dominic nodded absently, his eyes scanning the street. Most of the houses stood empty now, their windows dark and their yards abandoned. Moving trucks had been coming and going for weeks, carrying away the accumulated possessions of families who'd been scattered across the city to find new homes wherever they could afford them. But at number 47, he could see movement through the front window, a woman's silhouette packing boxes in the pre-dawn darkness. "Hold on," Dominic said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to make Tony look up from his clipboard. "I need to check something first." He walked across the street to the yellow house, his footsteps loud in the early morning quiet. The garden plot beside the porch was still there, the small tomato plants standing bravely in the harsh soil. Someone had built a little fence around them, made from wooden sticks and string, as if to protect them from the coming destruction. The fence was obviously the work of child's hands, crooked and endearing in its imperfection. The sight of that small barrier, so inadequate against the machinery that waited across the street, broke something open in Dominic's chest. Here was hope made tangible, a child's faith in the future expressed through sticks and string and careful tending. Jayden had known the demolition was coming, had accepted that his family would be displaced, but he'd still tried to protect the small green lives he'd nurtured. The front door opened, and Lisa appeared, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. She wore the same scrubs from the night before, suggesting she'd worked a double shift and come home just in time to oversee the final packing. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue and unshed tears. "Mr. Hayes, what are you doing here?" The formal address stung, reminding him that despite their conversation the day before, he was still the enemy, the man responsible for destroying her son's garden and her family's stability. "I came to see the demolition," Dominic replied, though that was only partially true. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." Lisa stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. The October air was sharp with the promise of winter, and she shivered in the thin scrubs that were adequate for heated hospital corridors, but insufficient for outdoor conversations. "Jayden's been having nightmares about the bulldozers. He's afraid they'll hurt the tomatoes." The image of a child having nightmares about construction equipment was almost too painful to bear. Dominic thought about his own childhood fears, the anxiety that had kept him awake worrying about rent money and utility bills, and whether his mother was safe working late at the bar. But his fears had been about abstract concepts like poverty and abandonment. Jayden's fears were concrete, literally approaching in the form of mechanical monsters that would erase his world. Where is he now? Still sleeping, finally. He was awake most of the night. Lisa's voice was thick with the kind of exhaustion that comes from worrying about things beyond your control. "We finished packing last night. The moving truck comes at 8. The casual mention of their departure time made the morning's destruction feel suddenly urgent. In a few hours, Lisa and Jayden would be gone, scattered to whatever corner of the city they could afford. The house would be empty, just another structure waiting for demolition. The garden would become collateral damage, casualties in the name of progress and profit margins. Dominic looked at the garden, at the careful fence, at the small green plants that had been tended with such hope. "He built a fence around them." "He said maybe it would help," Lisa replied, her voice breaking slightly as she looked at her son's handiwork. "I tried to explain that the bulldozers wouldn't see it, but he insisted. He said the tomatoes deserved a chance to grow." The words hit Dominic like a physical blow. The simple statement contained a worldview so fundamentally decent, so unshakably optimistic, that it made his own cynicism feel like a character flaw. Here was a child who believed that all living things deserved protection, who thought that effort and care could overcome any obstacle. The fence wouldn't stop the demolition, but Jayden had built it anyway, because the alternative was accepting that some things didn't deserve a chance. Behind him, he heard the rumble of the demolition equipment starting up. The foreman was probably wondering why he was delaying the schedule. His investors were expecting progress reports. The construction timeline was tight, and every day of delay cost money. But all he could see was Jayden's face, the way the boy had spoken about planting for whoever came next, giving his gift to strangers he'd never meet. The generosity of it, the selfless hope in the face of displacement and loss, made Dominic's chest ache with recognition and shame. The sound of heavy machinery warming up created a counterpoint to the morning birdsong, a mechanical growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the neighborhood. Dominic could feel the vibrations through his feet, the earth trembling in anticipation of the violence to come. In a few hours, this street would be transformed from a community into a construction site, from home into raw material for someone else's vision of progress. "Lisa," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the machinery, "how much do you owe on this house?" She looked at him in confusion, her exhausted mind struggling to process the unexpected question. "We don't own it. We rent from a property management company." "Who owns it?" "I don't know. The rent checks go to Riverside Property Management." "Why?" Dominic's mind was racing, calculating possibilities and consequences with the same intensity he brought to complex business deals. The properties in this neighborhood had been accumulated over several years through a network of holding companies and investment partnerships. Most of the current residents had no idea that their landlords were ultimately controlled by his development company, that their rent payments had been funding the very project that would displace them. "What if I told you that you didn't have to move, that you could stay?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Lisa stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, her face a mixture of hope and disbelief. The morning light caught the tears that had been threatening to fall, making them shine like small diamonds against her pale cheeks. "You can't just stop it," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "This is a huge development project. There are contracts, investors, jobs at stake." Her practical objections were valid, Dominic knew. The Riverside development represented millions of dollars in investment, months of planning, and the coordinated efforts of dozens of contractors and subcontractors. Stopping it now would trigger penalty clauses, breach of contract lawsuits, and the kind of financial chaos that could destroy smaller companies. But Hayes Development had the resources to absorb those losses, and more importantly, Dominic suddenly found that he didn't care about the money. "I'm the primary investor," Dominic replied, the full weight of his decision settling over him like a physical presence. "And I'm changing my mind." Before Lisa could respond, the front door burst open, and Jayden appeared in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in all directions like a small rooster's comb. His eyes were wide with the disorientation of sudden waking, but they quickly focused on the source of the mechanical noise that had pulled him from sleep. "Mom, what's all that noise?" He stopped when he saw Dominic, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something like hope. "Mr. Dominic, what are you doing here?" The boy's presence changed everything, transforming an adult conversation about real estate and development into something much more fundamental. Dominic found himself looking at the situation through Jayden's eyes, seeing not profit margins and construction timelines, but a child's world being threatened by forces beyond his understanding or control. "I came to see your garden," Dominic said, kneeling down to Jayden's eye level so they could speak as equals. "And to tell you that you won't have to leave." Jayden's mouth fell open, his young face cycling through disbelief, hope, and finally pure joy. "Really? We can stay?" "If you want to." The boy launched himself at Dominic, wrapping his thin arms around his neck in a fierce hug that nearly knocked him over. The embrace was desperate and grateful, carrying all the relief of a child who'd been preparing for loss and suddenly found himself reprieved. Dominic felt the boy's heartbeat against his chest, rapid with excitement and residual fear, and something inside him shifted permanently. "Thank you," Jayden whispered, his voice muffled against Dominic's shoulder. "Thank you, so much." Over the boy's head, Dominic met Lisa's eyes. She was crying openly now, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. Her hands were pressed to her mouth as if to hold back sobs, and her whole body shook with the effort of containing emotions too large for words. "I don't understand," she said when she could finally speak. "Why would you do this?" Dominic gently extricated himself from Jayden's embrace and stood, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. The question deserved honesty, even if the truth was complicated and painful. "Because 20 years ago, I was him. I was the kid planting hope in impossible soil, believing that if I just tried hard enough, I could make something beautiful grow. No one should have to choose between their dreams and their dreams. Home." The admission hung in the morning air, vulnerable and raw. Dominic had spent decades building an image of himself as a self-made success story, someone who'd transcended his humble beginnings through intelligence and determination. But standing here, facing the consequences of his own success, he realized that transcendence was really just another word for abandonment. He turned and walked back toward the demolition crew, his phone already in his hand. A foreman looked up as he approached, confusion written across his weathered face. Tony had been in this business long enough to recognize the body language of a man who'd made a difficult decision. "Change your plans, Tony," Dominic said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. "We're calling off the demolition." "What?" "But sir, we've got contracts, schedules, the whole crew is here ready to work." Tony's objections were predictable, rooted in the practical concerns of a man who understood timelines and budgets better than he understood the human cost of urban development. The demolition crew had been scheduled for weeks, their equipment transported and positioned, their safety protocols established. Calling it off now would create logistical chaos and financial penalties. "I'll pay for the day," Dominic replied, his tone brooking no argument. "And I'll handle the contracts. But this neighborhood isn't being torn down. Not today, not ever." The next few hours were a whirlwind of phone calls and emergency meetings. Dominic's business partner, Richard, was furious, his voice rising to near-shouting levels as he cataloged the financial implications of the decision. The two men had worked together for 8 years, building Hayes Development into one of Chicago's most successful real estate companies, but they'd never faced a disagreement of this magnitude. "You can't just cancel a $200 million project on a whim, Dominic. We have investors, contractors, pre-sales on the condominiums. This is financial suicide." Richard Calloway was 5 years older than Dominic, a Harvard MBA who'd come from old money and had never experienced the kind of poverty that shaped Dominic's childhood. He understood numbers and markets and profit margins, but he'd never learned to see past statistics to the human lives they represented. To him, the Riverside Project was an elegant solution to an urban planning problem, not a threat to families and communities. "Then we'll build them somewhere else," Dominic replied calmly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision he was making. "There are plenty of empty lots in the city that don't require displacing families. The profit margins won't be the same. The Riverside location was key to the project's success. We chose that neighborhood specifically because the land acquisition costs were minimal and the existing residents had no, quote, political influence." The casual way Richard dismissed the current residents as politically irrelevant struck Dominic like a slap. Had he become the kind of person who measured human worth by political influence? Had success turned him into someone who saw families like Lisa and Jayden as obstacles to be removed rather than lives to be considered? "Then we'll find a way to make it work with smaller margins." Richard's voice rose in exasperation, his careful professional demeanor cracking under the stress of watching millions of dollars disappear. "What's gotten into you? Yesterday you were ready to start demolition, and now you're throwing away the biggest deal of the year. Have you lost your mind?" Dominic thought about Jayden's garden, about the careful fence of sticks and string, about the way the boy had hugged him with such fierce gratitude. He thought about his mother's dreams of a real garden, about the choices she'd made and the sacrifices she'd endured. He thought about the man he'd become and the boy he'd once been, and the gulf between them that had grown wider with each year of success. "Maybe I have," he said quietly. "Or maybe I've finally found it." The legal complications were significant and expensive. There were penalties for breach of contract with the demolition company, compensation owed to subcontractors who'd cleared their schedules, and the complex matter of unwinding pre-sales to potential buyers who'd already put deposits down on condominiums that would never be built. The total cost of canceling the project would run into the tens of millions, money that would simply disappear from Hayes Development's balance sheet. But Dominic had built his fortune by finding creative solutions to impossible problems, and he attacked these challenges with the same determination that had carried him from Maple Street to the Chicago skyline. He negotiated settlements with contractors, restructured payment schedules with investors, and absorbed the financial losses with the same calm efficiency he'd once brought to profitable deals. More importantly, he had a new vision forming, one that excited him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Instead of luxury condominiums that would price out current residents, he would develop affordable housing that served the community already in place. Instead of displacing families, he would invest in infrastructure and amenities that would improve their lives without forcing them to leave. The Riverside Neighborhood Renewal Project, as it came to be known, would become a model for urban development that prioritized people over profit. The financial returns would be smaller, but the social impact would be immeasurable. And for the first time in his career, Dominic felt like he was building something that mattered beyond his bank account. Within a week, Dominic had assembled a team of architects and urban planners who specialized in community-centered development. The meetings were different from his usual business discussions, focused on social impact rather than financial returns, on long-term community building rather than quick profit maximization. He found himself energized by conversations about playgrounds and community gardens, about mixed-income housing and small business incubators. The lead architect was a woman named Maria Santos, whose firm had gained recognition for projects that preserved neighborhood character while improving living conditions. She brought a perspective that was entirely new to Dominic, talking about development as a tool for social justice rather than wealth accumulation. "The key is to involve the community in the planning process," Maria explained during their first meeting. "These residents aren't problems to be solved. They're partners in creating something better. They know what their neighborhood needs better than any outside developer ever could." The concept was revolutionary to Dominic, who'd spent his career making decisions about communities without consulting the people who actually lived in them. He'd relied on market research and demographic data, treating residents as consumers rather than collaborators. The idea of actually asking Lisa and Jayden and their neighbors what they wanted was both obvious and radical. He began spending more time in the neighborhood, walking the streets he'd once known so well, talking to residents about their hopes for the future. Many were skeptical at first. They'd heard promises from developers before. Politicians and business leaders had made grand speeches about urban renewal and community investment, but the reality was usually displacement disguised as improvement. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down from Lisa, was particularly direct in her assessment. "You want to make this place better for us? Or better for the kind of people who move in after you push us out?" The question cut to the heart of the matter, exposing the fundamental tension in urban development between improvement and displacement. Mrs. Chen had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, raising 3 children in a house she'd bought when it was all she could afford. She'd watched property values slowly rise and longtime residents gradually move away, priced out by their own neighborhood's success. "Better for you," Dominic replied, and found that he meant it. Better for the families who are already here, who've already invested their lives in this place. But Dominic's sincerity gradually won them over, especially when he started showing up at community meetings and listening to their concerns with genuine interest. He attended the monthly neighborhood association gatherings held in the basement of St. Mary's Church, sitting in folding chairs and drinking coffee from paper cups while residents talked about potholes and streetlights and the need for a proper playground. Jayden became his unofficial tour guide, showing him the best spots in the small park at the end of Maple Street, introducing him to the neighbors who had become his extended family. The boy had a natural curiosity about how things worked, asking questions about construction and design that showed a genuine interest in the built environment. "Mr. Dominic, why do they make buildings so tall downtown but not here?" Jayden asked one afternoon as they walked through the neighborhood together. "Different needs," Dominic explained, appreciating the child's thoughtful questions. "Downtown, space is expensive, so builders go up instead of out. Here, families need yards and gardens, space for children to play. Will you put yards in the new buildings?" "Absolutely. And gardens too. Maybe even bigger ones than what people have now." The boy's tomatoes were thriving, the plants now tall enough to require the stakes that Dominic had quietly provided. Jayden tended them with the same dedication he'd shown from the beginning, but now there was joy in his work instead of desperate hope. The fear that had marked his initial planting had been replaced by confidence in the future, faith that his efforts would be rewarded with growth. The transformation in Jayden mirrored changes throughout the neighborhood as word spread that the demolition was permanently canceled. Families began investing in home improvements again, painting porches and planting flowers with the security that comes from knowing you'll be around to enjoy the results. The sense of impending doom that had hung over the community for months lifted, replaced by cautious optimism about what the future might hold. Lisa had returned to her normal work schedule, but the stress lines around her eyes had softened. The constant worry about finding new housing, about maintaining Jayden's school enrollment, about the financial impact of moving, all of that had been lifted from her shoulders. She still worked 2 jobs, but now the money went toward improving their current situation, rather than desperately searching for alternatives. One evening, as Dominic was reviewing architectural plans in his office, his assistant buzzed him with an unusual request. "Mr. Hayes, there's a Lisa Bell here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." "Send her in," Dominic replied immediately, wondering what could have brought her downtown to his corporate headquarters. Lisa entered his office looking somewhat overwhelmed by the opulent surroundings. The marble floors, expensive artwork, and panoramic city views were a world away from the modest neighborhood where she lived. She wore a simple dress instead of her usual scrubs, and her hair was down, softening her features in a way that made her look younger and less burdened. In her hands, she carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth, the kind of old-fashioned presentation that suggested something homemade and meaningful. She moved carefully across the polished floors, clearly conscious of being out of her element but determined to complete her mission. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice uncertain as she took in the scale of his success. "I know you're busy." "Never too busy for you," Dominic replied, meaning it completely. He gestured toward the comfortable seating area near the windows, away from the imposing desk that created an artificial barrier between them. "Please sit down. Can I get you something to drink?" Lisa shook her head, settling into one of the leather chairs with obvious care. She seemed to be trying not to touch anything unnecessarily, as if afraid of leaving marks on the expensive furniture. The basket remained in her lap, whatever was inside important enough to bring her across the city to his office. "I brought you something," she said, uncovering the basket to reveal several perfect red tomatoes nestled in tissue paper. "From Jayden's garden. They're the first ones ready to harvest." Dominic stared at the tomatoes, his throat tightening with emotion he hadn't expected. They were small and imperfect, with the slightly irregular shape that comes from being grown in difficult conditions rather than commercial greenhouses. But they were beautiful in their imperfection, beautiful in their very existence, beautiful in what they represented. Each tomato showed the careful attention Jayden had given to his plants, the daily watering and weeding, the gentle training of vines up their wooden stakes. They were deep red with hints of orange, the color that comes from ripening in natural sunlight rather than artificial conditions. The stems were still attached, green and fresh, carrying the scent of the garden that had produced them. "He wanted to give you the first ones," Lisa continued, her voice soft with emotion. "He says you're the reason they had a chance to grow." Dominic picked up one of the tomatoes, feeling its weight in his palm. It was warm from the summer sun, and he could smell the green scent of the vine still clinging to its stem. The simple fruit represented so much more than produce. It was hope made tangible, faith rewarded, the proof that care and patience could create something beautiful even in the most unlikely circumstances. "They're perfect," he said quietly, his voice thick with feelings he couldn't quite name. "There's something else," Lisa said, her voice growing serious. "I've been thinking about what you did for us, for the whole neighborhood. I know it cost you a lot of money, and I know you didn't have to do it. I want you to know that it means everything to us." The gratitude in her voice was almost painful to hear. Dominic had made the decision to cancel the demolition impulsively, driven by emotion and memory rather than careful calculation. The financial cost had been significant but manageable given his resources. What he hadn't anticipated was how much the decision would change him, how much he would gain from giving up profit in favor of principle. "You don't need to thank me," he said, though her words meant more to him than any business award or industry recognition ever had. "Yes, I do," Lisa insisted, her voice growing stronger. "But more than that, I want you to know that you've given us more than just a place to live. You've given us hope. You've shown Jayden that there are people in the world who keep their promises, who do the right thing even when it's hard. That's a gift that will last his whole life." The words hit Dominic harder than any business success ever had. He thought about his mother, about the dreams she'd carried, and the sacrifices she'd made for his future. Maybe this was what she'd been working toward all along, not just his success, but his ability to use that success to help others. Maybe the real measure of achievement wasn't how much you accumulated, but how much you gave back. "How is Jayden doing?" he asked, needing to change the subject before his emotions overwhelmed him. Lisa's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entirely, erasing the worry lines and revealing the young woman she'd been before life had forced her to carry so much responsibility. "He's thriving. He started helping Mrs. Chen with her garden next door, teaching her what he learned from growing the tomatoes, and he's been talking about becoming an architect so he can design buildings that help people instead of just making money." Dominic felt a surge of pride, as if Jayden were his own son. The boy's desire to build rather than simply accumulate, to create structures that served communities rather than developers, suggested a wisdom that Dominic was only beginning to understand himself. "He wants to be like you," Lisa said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Dominic look up sharply. "He talks about you all the time, about how you came back to help, even though you didn't have to. You're his hero." The responsibility of that hit Dominic like a physical weight. To be someone's hero, to have a child look up to you and want to follow in your footsteps, that was more meaningful than any Fortune 500 ranking or business award. It was also terrifying, because heroes were supposed to be worthy of admiration, and Dominic wasn't sure he'd earned that designation. "I'd like to do more," he said suddenly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him. "For Jayden, for the neighborhood. I've been thinking about setting up a scholarship fund, helping kids from Riverside go to college, pursue their dreams." The idea had been forming in his mind for weeks, taking shape as he spent more time in the community, and saw the potential that was being wasted due to lack of opportunity. Children like Jayden, bright and curious and full of promise, who might never realize their potential simply because their families couldn't afford higher education. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "You've already done so much." "It's not enough," Dominic replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I spent 20 years running from this place, thinking I had to escape to succeed. But you can't really escape your past. You can only decide what to do with it." The admission was more honest than anything he'd said in years. Success had taught him to present himself as someone who'd transcended his origins, who'd left poverty behind through determination and intelligence. But standing in his expensive office, holding tomatoes grown by a child in the same soil where he'd once planted his own dreams, he realized that transcendence was really just another word for abandonment. Over the following months, the Riverside Neighborhood Renewal Project began to take shape in ways that surprised everyone involved, including Dominic himself. The first phase included renovation of existing homes, bringing them up to modern standards while preserving their character and affordability. Lisa's house was among the first to be updated, with new windows, updated plumbing, and a modern kitchen, but the yellow paint and front porch remained, along with the garden that had started it all. The renovations were done with unusual care for resident input and convenience. Families weren't displaced during construction, but were temporarily housed in nearby units while their homes were improved. The work was scheduled around school and work commitments, and residents had significant input into design decisions that would affect their daily lives. Dominic found himself spending more and more time in the neighborhood, not just overseeing the construction, but becoming part of the community in ways he'd never expected. He attended Jayden's school concerts, sitting in the crowded auditorium of Jefferson Elementary and applauding as the boy played recorder with more enthusiasm than skill. He helped with homework when Lisa was working late, discovering that his business math skills translated surprisingly well to fourth-grade word problems. The monthly community meetings at St. Mary's Church became a regular part of his schedule, and he gradually moved from observer to participant as residents grew comfortable with his presence. These gatherings were unlike any meetings he'd attended in the corporate world, focused on practical concerns like traffic safety and youth programs rather than profit margins and market share. Mrs. Chen had emerged as an unofficial community leader, her initial skepticism about Dominic's motives gradually giving way to cautious collaboration. She had a gift for cutting through bureaucratic language to identify what really mattered to families trying to build stable lives. "We don't need fancy amenities," she told him during one particularly productive meeting. "We need reliable heat in winter, streets safe enough for children to play, and jobs that pay enough to live on. Make those things happen, and we'll call it success." Her practical wisdom guided much of the project's development, helping Dominic understand that community improvement wasn't about imposing someone else's vision of betterment, but about addressing the actual needs of people who'd chosen to make their lives in this place. The scholarship fund grew beyond his initial vision, attracting donations from other successful individuals who had their own stories of overcoming difficult circumstances. The Riverside Scholarship Foundation would eventually help dozens of young people pursue their dreams, but Jayden would always be its inspiration, the boy who had reminded Dominic that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help something grow. The fund's first recipient was Maria Gonzalez, a high school senior who lived 3 blocks from Jayden and had been accepted to the University of Illinois to study engineering. Her parents worked in a factory that made auto parts, and while they were proud of their daughter's academic achievements, college tuition was far beyond their means. The scholarship not only covered her expenses, but connected her with mentors in the engineering field who could guide her career development. 1 year after the day the demolition was supposed to happen, Dominic stood in the community garden that now occupied the vacant lot at the end of Maple Street. What had started as an empty space used mainly for illegal dumping had been transformed into something beautiful and productive, a place where neighbors could grow food and flowers while building relationships across cultural and generational lines. Jayden was there, now 11, and noticeably taller, his hands still dirty from tending the expanded vegetable garden that had become a source of pride for the entire neighborhood. The tomatoes were thriving, but they were no longer alone. Peppers, carrots, lettuce, and herbs filled the raised beds that community volunteers had built with lumber donated by local businesses. The garden had become more than just a place to grow food. It was a symbol of what was possible when people worked together toward common goals. Elderly residents shared gardening wisdom with young families. Children learned about nutrition and responsibility by caring for plants, and the harvest was shared among neighbors who might not otherwise have much interaction. "Look," Jayden said, pointing to a new section of the garden where sunflowers towered above the other plants, their bright faces turned toward the late afternoon sun. "These are for you. I planted them because you helped us grow." Dominic knelt beside the boy, just as he had that first day, but this time the soil was rich and well-tended, nourished by the care of many hands and the investment of community resources. The sunflowers were magnificent, some reaching 8 feet tall with faces as broad as dinner plates, their seeds already beginning to form for next year's planting. "They're beautiful," he said, looking at the bright yellow faces that seemed to embody the optimism and resilience of the community around them. "They're not just beautiful," Jayden corrected with the seriousness that had never left him despite his young age. "They're strong. They grew tall because they had good soil and people who cared about them, just like us." The simple observation contained more wisdom than most business school case studies, more insight than most strategic planning sessions. Jayden had identified the essential elements of sustainable growth, whether in gardens or communities: good conditions and consistent care from people who had invested in the outcome. As the sun set over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that rivaled the sunflower's brilliance, Dominic felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. The sounds of the community settling into evening surrounded them: children's laughter from nearby yards, the gentle hum of conversation from front porches, the distant sound of someone playing guitar in their backyard. He had more money than he'd ever dreamed of, more success than he'd ever imagined possible when he was Jayden's age and kneeling in this same soil. But this quiet moment in a garden with a boy who had taught him the true meaning of wealth, this was what made it all worthwhile. The little boy he'd left behind all those years ago was finally home, not in the broken-down house with peeling paint, but in the community he'd helped build, in the lives he'd touched, in the hope he'd planted in impossible soil. And like Jayden's tomatoes, that hope was growing, reaching toward the light, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the ones that struggle the most to bloom. Dominic Hayes had returned to his childhood home and found much more than he'd left behind. He'd found his purpose, his family, and his future. He'd found that success wasn't about escaping your past, but about using it to build something better. And in the laughter of children playing in the community garden, in the satisfied faces of families who now had safe, affordable homes, in the bright eyes of a boy who still believed that anything could grow with enough care and determination, he'd found the greatest return on investment of his life. The story of the millionaire who came home wasn't really about demolition and development, profit and loss. It was about the simple truth that we all carry our childhoods with us, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is turn around, go back, and help the child we used to be. In saving Jayden's garden, Dominic had saved something in himself. In giving the boy a chance to grow, he'd finally learned when it really meant to bloom. Years would pass, and Jayden would indeed become an architect, designing buildings that served communities instead of just serving profit. The Riverside neighborhood would become a model for urban renewal, visited by city planners from around the world who wanted to understand how development could strengthen rather than destroy existing communities. The scholarship fund would grow and thrive, sending hundreds of young people to college and graduate school, creating a network of professionals who understood that success came with the obligation to lift others up. But none of that mattered as much as this moment. This simple recognition that home isn't a place you leave behind. It's the place where you learn to plant hope in impossible soil and tend it with love until it grows strong enough to be bloom. In the end, Dominic realized, the most important buildings he'd ever constructed weren't made of steel and concrete, but of trust and community, of second chances and shared dreams, of the understanding that we all be in grow better when we grow together.